If you look at the headlines coming out of Caracas or Washington regarding Venezuela, you are being fed a soap opera. It's a carefully curated script about democracy, authoritarianism, stolen elections, and human rights. You see images of protests in the streets, you hear rhetoric about the struggle for freedom, and you see the United States positioning itself as the moral arbiter of the Western Hemisphere. Turn it off. It is noise. It is a spectacle designed to keep your eyes on the stage while the real work is being done in the basement. If you want to understand why a country floating on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, 300 billion barrels of liquid equity, is starving, do not look at the ballot box. Look at the viscosity of the crude oil. Look at the specific chemical architecture of a barrel extracted from the Orinoco Belt. And then look at the engineering blueprints of the refineries sitting on the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. The story of Venezuela is not a story of ideology. Capital does not care about socialism. Capital does not care about dictatorship. If it did, the global economy would look very different. Capital cares about yield or actiure. The reality is that the United States and Venezuela are locked in a dysfunctional, toxic marriage not because of politics, but because of geology. For decades, the global energy map was drawn in a way that tethered these two nations together. But when the shale revolution happened in the United States, that map caught fire. What we are witnessing now, the sanctions, the poverty, the migration crisis, the diplomatic theater, is not a fight for the soul of a nation. It is a hostile corporate restructuring of the global energy market. It is a liquidation sale of a sovereign state managed by geopolitical hedge funds. You have been told the U.S. wants to liberate Venezuela. The truth is much darker. The strategy was never liberation. The strategy was to crash the asset price, starve the management, and force a distress sale. But there is a problem. The plan didn't just break Venezuela, it broke the supply chain that the American economy secretly relies on. We didn't just sanction a dictator, we sanctioned our own refineries. And now, the bill is coming due. Let's strip away the rhetoric and look at the ledger. To understand the present, we have to go back to the asset allocation. Venezuela holds roughly 18% of the world's proven oil reserves. That is more than Saudi Arabia. That is more than Russia. On paper, every Venezuelan citizen should be an aristocrat. So why are they walking through the Darien Gap with their lives in a backpack? The problem, and the opportunity, lies in the physics of the oil itself. Venezuela doesn't have oil in the way you might think of the light, sweet crude that bubbles up in Saudi Arabia or West Texas. Venezuela has sludge. It has extra heavy crude. It is thick, sulfurous, and full of metals. At room temperature, Venezuelan oil is almost a solid. You can walk on it. To get it out of the ground, you have to inject steam. To move it through a pipeline, you have to dilute it with lighter fluids, like naphtha. Historically, this wasn't a problem. It was a feature. In the 20th century, the major oil companies, Standard Oil, which became Exxon, and the others, built a symbiotic relationship. Venezuela would pump this heavy sludge, and the sophisticated refineries in the U.S. Gulf Coast were specifically engineered to process it. This is a crucial data point. You cannot simply feed any oil into any refinery. It's like blood types. A refinery built for heavy sour crude cannot run efficiently on light sweet crude. For 50 years, this was the deal. Venezuela sells to the U.S. The U.S. pays cash. The petrodollars flow back to Caracas to fund the state. Then came the pivot. When Hugo Chavez took power, he didn't just change the flag, he changed the balance sheet. He viewed PDVSA, the state oil company, not as a business, but as a piggy bank. He fired 18,000 of the most experienced engineers and geologists in 2003 following a strike. That is the moment the clock started ticking. You can print money, but you cannot print competence. Production began to plateau, then crash. But the real shift, the geopolitical knife in the back, happened when the U.S. discovered it could frack. The shale revolution. Suddenly, the United States became the world's largest oil producer. But here's the nuance that the news ignores. Fracking produces light, sweet oil. It's like champagne. The U.S. was drowning in champagne, but its refineries were built to drink Guinness. The U.S. Gulf Coast still needed heavy oil to blend with the light shale oil to operate efficiently. They needed Venezuela. However, as Caracas became more hostile, nationalizing assets and kicking out Exxon and ConocoPhillips, the risk premium skyrocketed. Caracas started looking for new bankers. They found them in Beijing and Moscow. Venezuela borrowed over $60 billion from China and billions more from Russia, paying them back not in cash, but in future oil shipments. By 2015, a massive chunk of Venezuelan production was already spoken for, shipped off to pay debts to geopolitical rivals of the United States. The cash flow dried up, the infrastructure rusted, and the U.S. watched as its strategic backyard became a forward operating base for Russian finance and Chinese infrastructure projects. This is where the strategy shifted in Washington. They saw a distressed asset managed by a hostile board of directors. The decision was made: pull the plug. If the oil is going to China and the profits are sustaining a regime hostile to U.S. interests, then the U.S. would weaponize the financial system to freeze the gears. They bet that the regime would collapse in months. They were wrong. They didn't understand the durability of a system that has abandoned its people but secured its military. We are now decades into this decline, and production has fallen from over 3 million barrels a day to barely 800,000. This isn't just a recession, it is the industrial deletion of a founding member of OPEC. Let's get into the mechanics of the stranglehold, because this is a masterclass in economic warfare and its limitations. When the Trump administration escalated sanctions to maximum pressure in 2019 and the Biden administration maintained the core of that architecture, they utilized a mechanic that is often misunderstood. It wasn't just about freezing bank accounts, it was about severing the physical supply chain of the molecule itself. Recall what I said about Venezuelan oil. It is solid. To move it, you need diluents, specifically heavy naphtha. For decades, the United States sold Venezuela the naphtha they needed to dilute their own oil so they could export it back to the United States. It was a circular trade. The sanctions cut off the flow of diluents. This is the equivalent of hiding a diabetic's insulin. Without the U.S. naphtha, Venezuela couldn't move its product to the ports. The pipelines clogged, the wells had to be shut in, and once you shut in a heavy oil well in the Orinoco Belt, the pressure drops, the sediment settles, and it is incredibly expensive, sometimes impossible, to restart it. We physically calcified their infrastructure, but the mechanism goes deeper into the financial plumbing: SWIFT. SWIFT is the nervous system of global finance. By cutting PDVSA, the state oil company, out of the dollar system, Washington forced every trade into the shadows. You cannot sell oil legally if you cannot clear the transaction in New York. So how does a country survive? They employ the discount. Venezuela began selling its oil at a massive discount, sometimes $30 or $40 below the market price, to anyone willing to take the risk. Who takes that risk? Independent Chinese teapot refineries, Russian intermediaries, and shadow traders based in Dubai. Here is how the laundry works. A tanker turns off its transponder, its GPS tracker, in the middle of the ocean. This is called going dark. It meets another tanker, perhaps flying a flag of convenience from Liberia or Panama. They perform a ship-to-ship transfer, STS. The Venezuelan oil is pumped into the new ship. That new ship mixes it with a little chemical additive and relabels the cargo as Malaysian bitumen or Oman blend. Suddenly, the oil has a new nationality. It sails to China, is offloaded, and the cash is paid through shell companies in Hong Kong or Turkey, often in yuan or rubles, bypassing the US dollar entirely. This mechanism created a parasitic economy. The regime in Caracas stopped caring about efficiency or national prosperity. They shifted to a mafia model. As long as enough cash came in to pay the military generals and the security apparatus, the country could burn. But there is another side to this mechanic, the U.S. side. Remember Citgo? Citgo is a U.S. company headquartered in Houston with gas stations on every corner, but it is owned by PDVSA. It is the crown jewel of Venezuela's foreign assets. When the sanctions hit, the U.S. effectively seized control of Citgo, handing the keys to the opposition government, which held no actual power in Venezuela. But here is the absurdity. Citgo's refineries in Lake Charles and Corpus Christi were built for Venezuelan heavy crude. When the sanctions cut off the supply, Citgo had to go out into the open market and buy expensive heavy crude from elsewhere, Canada, or Mexico, crushing their margins. So the mechanic worked in two ways. It forced Venezuela into the arms of the black market, stripping the state of legitimate revenue and empowering smugglers. And simultaneously, it starved U.S. energy infrastructure of its preferred feedstock, driving up costs for American manufacturers. This is the definition of a blunt instrument. We tried to perform heart surgery with a sledgehammer. We stopped the flow of blood, yes, but we also induced a stroke in the patient and damaged our own circulation in the process. The system isn't just broken. It has been rewired into a machine that converts Venezuelan natural resources into illicit cash for the regime and higher prices for you. Here is the twist, and it is a bitter pill for the strategists in the State Department. The policy of isolation did not isolate Venezuela. It integrated Venezuela into an anti-American resistance bloc. We assumed that if we broke the Venezuelan economy, the military would turn on Maduro. We applied the logic of a boardroom. The CEO is losing money, so the shareholders will vote him out. But a dictatorship is not a publicly traded company. It is a criminal enterprise. When the revenue shrinks, the loyalty doesn't vanish. It consolidates. The circle gets smaller. The money that does come in is funneled strictly to the guys with the guns. The sanctions actually made the regime more stable in the short term because the regime became the only source of food and money. If you wanted to eat, you had to bow to the state. But the real backfire is geopolitical. By kicking Venezuela out of the dollar system, we forced them to innovate. We pushed them into a marriage of convenience with Iran. This is the nightmare scenario that the Monroe Doctrine was written to prevent. Iran, also under heavy U.S. sanctions, saw an opening. They started sending Venezuela the one thing they desperately needed: condensates, a diluent, and technicians to repair the refineries. In exchange, Iran got Venezuelan gold and run of the place. We now have Iranian operatives and military advisors operating freely in the Western Hemisphere, protecting the regime that controls the oil we use to refine. Furthermore, look at the Ukraine war. This was the catalyst that exposed the hypocrisy of the entire strategy. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the U.S. banned Russian oil imports. Suddenly, the global market was tight. Prices spiked. The Biden administration found itself in a panic. They needed heavy oil to replace the Russian barrels. Where is the nearest massive source of heavy oil? Venezuela. So, in a moment of supreme irony, Washington quietly sent a delegation to Caracas, the same Caracas they labeled a narco-terrorist regime, to negotiate. They needed the oil back. This led to the Chevron license. The U.S. Treasury issued a special license allowing Chevron to go back into Venezuela, pump oil, and export it only to the United States. Think about what that admits. It admits that the U.S. energy grid is vulnerable without this specific resource. It admits that our moral stance is flexible when gas prices hit $5 a gallon. And here is the ultimate backfire. The regime in Caracas knows this. They realized they have leverage again. They know the U.S. cannot afford a price spike in an election cycle. So they play the game. They promise an election, the U.S. lifts some sanctions, the oil flows, then they ban the opposition candidate, and the U.S. threatens to snap back sanctions, but they hesitate. Why? Because we need the barrels. We are now trapped in a cycle of our own making. We cannot fully crush them because we need their product, but we cannot normalize relations because they are a geopolitical adversary aligned with Russia and China. The sanctions created a dark fleet of ghost tankers that now roam the oceans, immune to Western regulation. This shadow fleet moves millions of barrels of oil around the world, ensuring that the price cap mechanisms we try to place on Russia or Iran will never fully work. We taught them how to bypass us. We created a parallel financial system that is now large enough to sustain our enemies indefinitely. The weapon we used, access to the US dollar, is losing its potency because we used it too often. You might be sitting there thinking, okay, this is a fascinating game of Risk, but I live in Ohio, or Manchester, or Sydney. What does this have to do with me? It has everything to do with the purchasing power of the currency in your pocket and the stability of the grid that powers your home. When we talk about inflation, we are often talking about energy in disguise. Energy is the master input. It costs energy to grow food, to transport goods, to manufacture steel. When the cost of energy goes up, the cost of existence goes up. The Venezuelan debacle is a direct contributor to the sticky inflation you are feeling right now. Remember the distinction between light and heavy oil? Heavy oil is rich in middle distillates. That's fancy talk for shale, diesel. Diesel is the lifeblood of the global supply chain. Trucks, trains, ships, and farm equipment run on diesel. The U.S. refineries that produce the world's diesel run best on the heavy oil that Venezuela possesses. By taking 2 million barrels a day of that specific oil off the legitimate open market, we created a structural shortage of diesel capacity. When diesel prices stay high, the price of your Amazon delivery stays high. The price of bread stays high because the tractor and the delivery truck cost more to run. You are paying a geopolitical tax on every single item you buy. Furthermore, consider the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR. The U.S. drained its emergency oil savings to historic lows to fight gas prices in 2022. That reserve was our insurance policy against a major war. It is now half empty. To refill it, we need cheap oil. But because we have segmented the global market, sanctioning Russia, sanctioning Iran, sanctioning Venezuela, cheap oil is a thing of the past. We have entered an era of structural energy scarcity. And let's talk about your retirement. If you have a 401k or a pension fund, you are exposed to this risk. The Western financial system is built on the assumption of infinite growth powered by affordable energy. If the energy input costs permanently reset higher because we have fractured the global supply chain into West versus East, profit margins across the S&P 500 compress. This isn't just about gas prices, it's about the liquidity of the sovereign debt markets. The US dollar's dominance is partly anchored in the fact that oil is traded in dollars. As Venezuela, Russia, China, and Iran build this non-dollar trade network, trading oil for yuan or gold, the demand for dollars decreases at the margin. If the world needs fewer dollars to buy energy, the U.S. cannot print money as recklessly as it has been without causing hyperinflation. The Venezuelan experiment was a test case for de-dollarization, and while it destroyed Venezuela, it provided the blueprint for how the rest of the BRICS nations can insulate themselves from the U.S. Treasury. You are watching the erosion of the exorbitant privilege that has allowed Western consumers to consume more than they produce for 50 years. Venezuela is just the canary in the coal mine. The bird is dead, and the air in the mine is getting thin. So, where do we stand? Venezuela is a tragedy, yes, but it is also a mirror. It reflects the harsh reality of a world shifting from unipolar American hegemony to a fractured, multipolar brawl for resources. The old world order was built on a simple premise: free trade, open sea lanes, and the US dollar as the lubricant. In that world, it didn't matter if you were a communist or a capitalist. You sold your oil on the open market, and the system worked. That world is gone. We have replaced efficiency with security. We have replaced the invisible hand with the iron fist. In the next 6 to 12 months, watch the Caribbean. The thawing of relations between the U.S. and Venezuela is not a sign of peace. It is a sign of desperation. The West is realizing that in a war of attrition against great powers, you cannot afford to leave the world's largest oil reserves sitting on the sidelines, or worse, in the hands of your enemy. We will see a cynical, slow-motion reintegration of Venezuelan oil into the Western fold. The rhetoric about democracy will soften. The handshakes with Maduro's representatives will become more frequent. Not because he changed, but because we need the diesel. This is the lesson you must internalize. Morality is a luxury of surplus. When scarcity hits, principles are the first assets to be liquidated. Venezuela teaches us that being rich in resources is not a blessing. It is a target. If you cannot defend your wealth, it will be stripped from you, either by a corrupt local government or by a foreign banking system. As we move forward, the conflict isn't going to be about borders on a map. It's going to be about the flows of energy. The countries that control the molecules will dictate the terms. The countries that only control the currency, they might find that paper burns a lot faster than oil. Don't look at the politicians. Watch the tankers. That's where the truth is heading.